The one thing.
Welcome to Bigfoot
and the Bunny.
This is a couple's journey into the mysterious,
the unknown, and the
paranormal. I'm your host, Chris Carr.
And I'm your host, Kristen Johnson.
Together we are Bigfoot and the Bunny.
Welcome to Bigfoot and the Bunny. I'm your host, Chris Carr.
And I'm Kristen Johnson.
And we hope you guys have had a good week. We've had a pretty good, interesting week. Didn't do a lot of paranormal investigation.
We kind of had a rough week.
Yeah.
On our side, my grandmother passed away a couple of days ago, so bear with me, please.
She did, and may she rest in peace.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Only other thing
we
did is I started this book here, Practical Gin Magic, on the recommendation of Ken Allen. And
our friend
Ken from the Wizard's Table podcast,
who is on right after us.
Giving a big shout out, and started with that, and that's been interesting. And I've been sort of journaling what's been going on since I was interested in this gin stuff, and that may show up as a podcast or two. And we also are almost done with the Charles Christian podcast. Yes. Finally. A year later with the interviews. Sorry, Charles. And that's coming out very good. We got some music for it, and we put the interviews together and just got to kind of tweak it a little bit. And then that should be out in the next day or two. So that's good news. Other than that, it's been mostly like blah, blah, blah.
This is what we say a lot.
Blah, 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 blah.
And here it is. Where's the cricket button?
Blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, we love that.
That is Alex Lifeson from Rush. We are huge Rush fans, and we say that all the time. We're actually looking for masks that say blah, blah, blah on them, shirts and stuff.
Exactly.
Yep.
So without further ado, we'll bring you right to our very special guest this week. Her name is Morgan Daimler. She is the author of more than 24 books on subjects relating to Irish mythology, paganism, and fairies. She has contributed to multiple anthologies and magazines, as well as taught workshops on these topics across the United States and internationally. Some of her books include A New Dictionary of Fairies, a 21st century exploration of Celtic and related Western European fairies, Traveling the Fairy Path, Pagan Portals, Brigid, Meeting the Celtic Goddess of Poetry, Forge, and Healing Well, and Fairycraft, Following the Path of Fairy Witchcraft. And so without further ado, I'm going to say that again. Let me bring her onto the stream. Hide this.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. How are you doing?
I'm good. I got sucked into your introduction talking about that practical gin magic. Now I want to go find that book.
Oh yeah,
nice.
It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of interesting history, even though a lot of it's conflicting about what it is and what's been written. And obviously it goes back a long ways, and it's not quite rubbing a lamp, but it's pretty neat.
The genie lamp.
Yeah, I don't know too much about gin, but I find them really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I'm learning. So we had a guest, a friend of ours, Ken Allen, come on, and he knows a lot about it. That was just something he recommended.
He works with them, and he's on.
So,
yeah.
Yes, and
there's a lot of similarities.
Page is still up there. There we go. I'm so sorry. Wow, really good with the electronics over here. Here we go.
I can see it.
I thought I took it out. My bad. But before the show, we were talking a little bit about fairies, and that they aren't exactly the cute little winged children,
As much as I wish they were.
and always maybe not look like their photographs. So, could you tell us a little about that and how you
Sure. I mean, some of them could be the cute little winged children, but the term fairy, even though now in like modern Western culture we tend to immediately picture that sort of Tinkerbell kind of figure. Historically across its usage, which goes back like 700 years, it's always been sort of a catch-all term. So it's really indicating any being who comes from the world of fairy, the other world. And that encompasses a huge range of different types of beings. So we see animals, for example, fairy cats, fairy hounds, fairy horses. We see a range of different types of more humanoid fairies, some that look very, very human, but are sort of distinguished by this otherworldly background and this power that they have to them. Some that are more what we would kind of picture from pop culture, the little like 18-inch tall kind of beings, giants. I mean, it really is just this enormous range. To me, is one of the most fascinating things about it when you start getting into it and interested in it, is there's so much to it. There's so much depth to it. The more you learn, the more you realize that you have more to learn. Kind of a thing.
Well, that makes sense.
When you say they're from a different realm, could you explain that, please? Okay.
I can try. I don't think anybody knows for certain what that other realm is exactly. It's usually described as a world that is adjacent to or connected to the human world, but is not here.
So like a different dimension.
Yeah, some people look at it as a different dimension. Some people look at it as a different plane of existence.
Sure.
I have seen people more recently referring to fairies into this world as sort of extra dimensional beings or interdimensional beings.
Sure.
So that is certainly one way to kind of understand how everything fits together. But sort of the hallmark of what makes these beings what they are is that they come from somewhere that's different, but they can come into the human world and interact in the human world, and get up to all sorts of things in the human world. But they're not limited the way that humans would necessarily be to this reality, to this realm. They can sort of move back and forth between this world and their own world. So, and humans can be taken into the other world, I should say. We have a lot of folklore and stories about that sort of thing happening. So I wanted to make it clear that it's not a place that, humans can't get into. It's just not a place that we have a natural ability to get into.
Sure. I know we have one here. It's called the puck wedgie. Mm-hmm. That's what they call ours here. And it's just like what you said, and they believe it's from a different realm. And the Native Americans here, the Wampanoag, named them that. And they're tricksters. They can be nice if you give them offerings, but they're more or less not happy with you when you're, stomping around the ground. So
trickster spirits, and supposedly found in the Freetown Forest.
Yes, in the Freetown Forest.
Fall River.
Yeah,
Freetown.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about fairies, the word, of course, it's an English word. We kind of see it mostly applied to sort of Western European beings, but that same concept, this idea of these otherworldly beings that can interact with humans and can be helpful, can be harmful, can be mischievous, we find that all around the world. Pretty much this idea of these fairy-like creatures, beings, like you mentioned, in the United States, different Native American groups have them.
Mhm.
Obviously, also in Canada. You find them in Central America, South America, all over Europe, Asia, Africa. They're just anywhere there's humans, you're going to find this idea of these beings. Different names, of course, in different places. Like you mentioned, the Pukwudgies. I'm sure I just said that wrong, but
You said it right, Pukwudgie.
Pukwudgies.
yeah. I've read about them, but I have to admit I've never actually said the word before. So
No worries. It's more of a local thing, I'm pretty sure. Anyways,
Yeah.
we don't hear a lot about it out of this area, immediate area. I should
Those
say.
and Taipaiwankas.
I haven't heard of that one. That's interesting.
That's
Yeah.
they're balls of light, and they believe that it's the fairies coming down. They're like fairies, yeah. So,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, in Ireland, obviously they're taken a lot more seriously than they are here in the U.S.
And England too.
England too.
Yes.
And that in Ireland, I know they've rerouted roads, right? And
yep.
For even modern times, I know I read about one a while ago that they had rerouted around a fairy mound, which is where the fairies supposedly live.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a major road in like the 1950s. They rerouted it.
Yeah.
But there may be even more newer stuff. I don't know.
Yep. You have that. You have you're probably referencing there was a very sort of well-known instance that happened in the 1990s with a fairy tree. They were building a major motorway, and the fairy tree was sort of smack in the middle of where the roadway was supposed to go. And there was a lot of, I won't say outcry exactly, but it got a lot of publicity and attention. And one of the major kind of storytellers who's well known over in Ireland, Eddie Lenihan, was very public about this being a fairy tree and that there were all these local stories attached to this tree in this location. And they got the road rerouted to kind of leave it alone. So that definitely, yeah. And Iceland actually is like that as well. In Iceland, there's accounts. They don't have trees. Iceland in general doesn't have a lot of trees, to be fair, compared to other places. But they don't have fairy trees over there the way you have in Ireland. They call them Alfakirkjan, elf churches, literally, but it's rocks, big rocks. And it's supposed to be places where the Alfar, the elves, live and kind of go in and out of. And there have been accounts there of roads that were rerouted because there was an elf stone, there was an elf church in the way.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting story. You can find this if you Google it. It was in the news where they were doing road construction and there was an elf stone there and it kind of got covered like in dirt and general, road construction debris. And they started having all sorts of problems. And the people in the town that was close to it, people were hearing music and hearing voices and hearing all sorts of things. And so they had to go out and basically the construction crew had to clean off this elf stone and sort of apologize.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really an interesting story. But it did. And then everything settled back down. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, so there's definitely places where they take this stuff very seriously.
Exactly. Absolutely. That was kind of the point I was making because in the U.S., we don't, the fairies are kind of like, yeah, you get the fairy count. It's cute. It's all a little pretty. Got a little statue on the shelf, blah, blah, blah. No offense, Kristen. Kristen has a few of them. I've taught her a few of them. But in Ireland and Iceland, these things are taken much more seriously and, they can have ill effects. What exactly constitutes like a fairy mound in Ireland?
Generally, there's specific places that are just traditionally known. Like people know that these are fairy hills, and some of them are architectural places. They're, I shouldn't say architectural, archaeological. There we go. Archaeological sites. They're places that were originally Iron Age or Bronze Age human creations, but had fallen out of use and kind of became really overgrown. So they have this distinct kind of shape to them that doesn't look really like a natural hill. So they became associated or known as these fairy mounds. She is what they're called in Irish. And you also have other places as well that aren't necessarily human made, but there's something unique or something that sets it apart from sort of the natural, normal landscape. For example, in Sligo, there's a mountain called Ben Bulben, and on the side of the mountain, there's this square of white stone, just invisible in this dark stone mountainside. And that's said to be an entranceway into the other world, into the world of fairy. Obviously, that's not man-made. It's a naturally occurring, whatever it is. And it's not something that can be reached. Like, you can't physically get to it as a human. But it has this association. It has this story attached to it. So generally, these are places that it's just been passed down through the generations.
Like
People
folklore.
know. Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we do have the same thing to different degrees in the U.S. In Connecticut, there's a state park called Devil's Hop Yard, and there's stories relating to that, for why it got that name and that it has spirits there. That were one of the stories going back over 100 years. That location is a gentleman was riding a horse at the time through on a road, and these dark shadow figures, shadowy shapes started chasing him, and they were jumping from treetop to treetop, chasing him and his horse out of it. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely not how I would want to spend an evening.
No.
Personally.
No, not at all. You wonder, like, those things, how they play into some of the modern supernatural phenomena that people report. Especially when we get into things like shadow figures. And actually, when you say hopping treetop to treetop, that reminded me of the story of Mercy Brown, Rhode Island's first vampire, who was known to come back and supposedly jump from rooftop to rooftop and through the trees. And
interesting.
Another local legend that's pretty popular.
You're from New England as well. That's where we're from as well.
Right. Right. We initially thought, oh, she must be from Ireland, because you certainly have the Irish look about you.
You do.
My grandfather was from Ireland. So
is that right?
Yeah.
How did you get into the Irish mythology? Was it through him, or what sparked that?
Pretty much through family. Sort of growing up in the Irish American diaspora, people who moved here from Ireland and that sort of community. And then, for myself personally, I've always had kind of what I guess you'd call paranormal experiences. And as I was getting older meaning like into my teenage years, I started looking into the folklore and the sort of body of collected material about it. And I went to Ireland. I looked at Irish culture, I think, because of my grandfather, because of that connection. And I just needed a way to kind of make sense of things. Mm-hmm. And like I said, then once you start, it just kind of pulls you in.
Mm-hmm. We understand that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You try to make sense of the things that happened in your youth. That was kind of sparked both of us to get into paranormal things as well, and magic and other things. But what kind of experiences did you have as a child that sparked this?
Oh, all sorts of things, to be honest. And I'm really lucky because my parents were very tolerant of me being a very odd child, frankly. I mean, I used to build little fairy houses when I was like 6 or 7. I didn't know what I was doing. No one had told me or, taught me anything about that. It just sort of, I started doing it. I used to, when I was older and I could write, I would write letters to the fairies and leave them in the windowsill, and just all sorts of randomness that I got up to.
It's really cool.
It's something. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, well, obviously you felt they were there. Do you have memories of seeing them or encountering them in some way?
Yep. One of my earliest memories connected to this, I was probably 5, right around 5 years old. And the room that I was sleeping in at the time, my bedroom, was one of those rooms where like the window faced the street and there was a street light and there were trees. And so we had all these weird shadows on the walls. And I was 5. I mean, I was fairly little. So I'd get very upset and cry and all that. And I have a distinct memory of this woman coming into my room or being in my room with me when I was that age, when I was upset and crying, and just being comforting me, telling me it was okay. I don't think I realized what she was until later. At the time, it was just comforting. I wasn't supposed to get up out of bed or bother my mother or anything, so I would just sit there by myself and cry. It's very sad. It's a sad story. But I would have this, this presence that would appear. It was definitely not a human ghost kind of a thing.
Okay.
To be clear.
No, sure. I
realized,
perfectly understand this. Yeah.
Yeah. I realize human ghosts are another option, but.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
No, that's really cool. I can relate to that. And we both grew up in kind of haunted houses ourselves. And one of the things that I was haunted by was actually these little clown dolls. They were stiff figures, believe it or not.
Dolls.
Yeah, clowns. And you think I have a fear of clowns, but I don't. I have no fear of clowns at all. But I did then. And they used to talk to me, and I have these memories of this stuff, which sounds bananas, but I remember it like it just happened, even though I was a little kid. So, I wouldn't call that necessarily a human spirit. I don't know what it was, but, it was a good one and a sort of good one and a bad one. And they used to tell me horrible things.
What did you do with those clowns?
I buried them.
He literally buried them. He was so upset.
Well, I have a memory of it.
He's like 4 years old. He's burying clowns in the backyard.
Right.
That's a good instinct, though.
They're probably worth like a fortune now. They were these old German
That's a good instinct.
things, and of course, gone.
Yep.
But,
yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of us have childhood traumatic clown incidents.
yeah, right.
When I was growing up,
paranormal. A lot of our guests.
lived in a.
Well, I probed that a little bit. Have had, grew up in a haunted house or had some kind of supernatural experience when they were young, and it blossoms into something else. And I think it's like maybe one of the reasons why we all get involved in this stuff or have an interest in it, because of these things that may have happened when we were children.
Yep. When I was growing up, not a little older than 5. It was probably 9 or 10 when this started. My sister and I, because of our parents' schedules, we were kind of alone a lot with each other. She's 2 years younger than I am. And we had a ghost in our house, or, with our family. I'm not actually unclear on whether it's the house that's haunted or this was just something that kind of was with our family. And it was always sort of a friendly presence, and it would do things like, if your hands were full, it would open the door for you. Or close the door. I mean, we were kids, This started when I was 10. This went on until I was probably 16 or 17. And we just started calling it Charlie because you got to call it something.
Right.
And we weren't, like I said, we weren't afraid of it. It never did anything scary. But then come to find out later on, that was actually one of our great-grandparents' names was Charles.
Wow.
So we had started to wonder when we were a little older if maybe that was like the ghost of a great-grandparent.
Maybe.
Sure.
To this day, I don't know.
It's still, that's really cool that they're helpful. I always have, asked my spirits in my house, you could help me with like dishes or something, right?
Give them a job. Hey, if you're going to hang around here, there's some laundry that needs to be folded.
Yeah, and
but
vacuum for me or something,
I would also appreciate that. That would be awesome.
I remember asking.
And to be clear, like not all of my experiences are good experiences, but that one.
Totally understand. They're not all bad.
That was a good one.
It's just that the experience and your logical mind just cannot wrap around how did this happen, right? So kind of plants the seed of what maybe blossoms into a lifelong interest in the supernatural, the mysterious, the unknown, the
paranormal. You have
and that's why we're all here.
Right, exactly. You have a background in paganism, I believe, right? Magic.
And fairy witchcraft.
Yep.
Could you tell us a little how that works?
Yes, please.
Like, are there pantheons in it, or how does that work? Like, I know a lot of path work, involves, like, if you study Egyptian magic or even with this jinn stuff, there's some sort of a pantheon that exists. How does that work with fairies?
Sure. So I had mentioned my parents were very kind of accepting of my randomness growing up. Some of that is because we weren't raised with any particular religion. The classic tale that my father was Catholic and my mother was Protestant. So in order to get married in the 70s, they had to agree that they would not raise their children with any religion, which is what they did. So having all of these kind of paranormal experiences and whatnot going on, when I was a teenager, actually I was probably 11 or 12, I stumbled upon neo-pagan witchcraft. And to me, it made a lot of sense. It answered a lot of questions because I was already having these experiences that are kind of in line with that belief system anyway, because it's very open and embracing of the supernatural. And as I went on and as I got older, because fairies are such sort of a big thing in my life, studying them and the folklore and just, the experiences that I personally have, it kind of was a natural thing for me to combine the two and to look at sort of how they'd work together. And then in the last 10 years or so, I found out there's a lot of precedent for that, actually, going back hundreds of years, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, and then somewhat in England. So the way it works generally for me, I don't have a pantheon per se, but there are sort of more powerful beings in the wider concept of the world of fairy kings, fairy queens, that sort of thing, which have been considered gods in human mythology before. I hope that doesn't sound confusing.
No, I understand that as like Morgan Le Fay or Morgan.
Yep.
Sure. And you get into
exactly.
the idea of, like, archetypes, and does that play a role? Like, the archetypical entity of represents this, kind of transcends through folklore into being this over here. And we're going to ask that because we know it's good with, love, money, whatever it is.
Yep.
Maybe
Yep, there's
offerings and things of that nature.
Yep. And there's a whole concept in the particular fairy witchcraft that I practice, and that I teach, other people practice, of what we call liminal gods, which you could kind of look at through that archetypal approach. They don't have names, they go by titles. So like Lady of the Greenwood, that sort of thing. And those you would definitely look at connecting to or calling on based on sort of those wider concepts, those archetypes of what they represent or what they resonate with.
Like the Green Man?
Yep, like that kind of concept.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love that whole idea of earth magic and earthy things, because both of us love being in nature.
Mm-hmm.
There's just something that's spiritual that occurs when
Absolutely.
you get away from the city and get away from people.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That idea of the sort of the power of the natural world and connecting to it. Of course, I mean, you find these beings, these fairy beings everywhere, in the wild and in urban areas and the suburbs. They're kind of everywhere that a human would be. You could potentially experience these beings, but there's a lot of power in connecting to the natural world, and the cycles that we find there, or at least I find there is, that it's enriching.
Absolutely. We agree with you. Definitely.
When you say cycles, do you mean also seasonal cycles and things of that nature?
Yep.
Solstices?
The solstices and the equinoxes. And my particular approach, I tend to do more with the stars, with constellations. So like the Pleiades are a big thing for me. But that idea, yeah. I went to Iceland in 2018. There's a whole long story behind
We've got
how
time.
Yeah, we've got a lot of time.
Do tell.
because originally I was very much more aligned with the solstices, the equinoxes, kind of the, if you look up neo-pagan holidays on Wikipedia or wherever, you're going to get that list of 8, that sort of thing. And their agricultural cycles, their solar cycles. And in 2018, I went to Iceland with a group, and we were doing a tour, which was absolutely amazing, by the way. If you ever have a chance to go to Iceland, 100% do it.
Love to go
it's
there.
a gorgeous, gorgeous place. And so much activity, supernatural activity there. It's amazing. And while we were there, my friend who was doing the tour with me had kind of gotten us up one night, me and another friend and her friend, and decided we were going to go on like a 10 o'clock nighttime hike, which was an adventure. And we ended up having a lot of really intense, I guess you'd say, paranormal experiences. And this was all 4 of us experienced it. So I have witnesses. I'm not just being hyperbolic here.
Oh, we're pretty open-minded here on Bigfoot and the Bunny, so just feel free.
Yeah. We went outside to begin with, and it was supposed to be a quarter moon, and it was a full moon. So we were kind of commenting to each other, like, well, this is weird. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think that's supposed to happen for like a week. We actually have pictures of it. We took pictures on our phones, and you can see it's a full moon. So like, well, that's strange. And then we started walking out, and we got lost, even though where we were is not the kind of place that you can get lost in. We were at this bed and breakfast, and we couldn't find the way to get to the path we were trying to take.
Oh no.
So that was a whole adventure. And then we kept seeing these dark shapes kind of moving on the hillside. And we finally found the place we had wanted to go, and sort of decided we were going to not do that because there was just so much activity. So many things you could see kind of all over the place. So we ended up turning around and going back after all of that drama. And when we got back to the room, we were, standing at they had like double sliding glass doors, and talking and still watching all of these dark figures on this hillside. To this day, it's one of the more intense things I've ever seen. And you could see that the Pleiades, the constellation, was just at the top of the hill, and it looked like a bonfire, like a blue bonfire. Very, very beautiful.
Must have been beautiful.
It sounds,
Yeah.
really
Yeah,
intense.
They don't have the light pollution in Iceland that you find in other places, pretty much everywhere else.
Mhm.
So the night sky is so clear. It's just so
I love that. Whenever I'm in an
clear.
area where you don't have that pollution, like going to Upper Maine or something, you can see
Everything.
every star. It's just amazing the difference between there and where the rest of the humans live.
Yeah, it really is. We don't realize how much light pollution we have until you go somewhere like that, and you could just see everything. And we were talking, and then we were, heard a voice on the wind, kind of a thing. I mean, the whole night was just
That's really
off
cool.
the hook.
That's really cool. We'd love to go to Iceland, right?
Absolutely.
That is on the bucket list.
Should.
It is.
I highly recommend it.
There's a lot of history there. It's very interesting.
Well, when this COVID's over, maybe we can all go.
Exactly. We're working on it.
Yeah.
We are working on it.
Yeah, it's
been a long year.
absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, that's definitely like Chris said, it's on our bucket list.
Definitely do it. If you have a chance, do it. But that whole situation, that whole night, then we found out that it's called the achronical rising of the Pleiades. It's a particular time in the cycle of the constellation where it's on the horizon, basically right after the sun sets. And we sort of jumped off from there and decided that this might actually be like a important cycle in some way.
Sure.
And So then I started sort of putting it together and going from there. So for the past several years, instead of doing the solstices and equinoxes, I've been following that constellation and that cycle, and really interesting experiences connected to that. So
Wow, that's awesome. What an awesome story. Absolutely.
That's my go Iceland tourism story. It was a great trip in general. A lot of interesting things happened while we were there.
It sounds like it. Hopefully that happens when we go.
Yeah. I think you've talked about dreams as well in your writings, and how they correlate with supernatural events.
Yep. A lot of the things that I use to sort of build my practice or move forward with things are based on dreams, which a lot of people, I think these days, when you hear dream, we sort of immediately discount it a bit. Dreams are kind of silly, and we sort of look at it as it's just the brain kind of talking to itself. But actually, up until fairly recently, dreams were always taken very seriously. There's a lot of information out there talking about the importance of dreams and how dreams were sort of always considered to be an aspect of reality. Obviously, everyone does have those moments where you're just having a weird whatever it is going on in your brain. But the idea that you can actually, encounter spirits and encounter fairies and have these sorts of experiences while we're sleeping, there's a lot of history to that. It really wasn't until psychology became a thing, which is not me insulting psychology.
No,
I actually have a psych degree, so I love psychology. It's awesome.
You that you do, yeah.
I do, yeah. But it really wasn't until psychology came along and was just like, oh no, it's all just things we need to interpret. It's our subconscious talking to us. Prior to that, it was taken really seriously. There's actually some good material out there sort of talking about how the church would kind of try to control the things when people were having dreams and having these experiences, because they needed to have the right framework on things. You couldn't have just everyone dreaming about this saint and messages from God. There had to be some kind of system for it to sort of decide what was legitimate and what you were going to listen to and what you weren't. But that was how seriously they took it.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow. I didn't know that.
How did they push those ideas through the sermons, or?
Yeah, through sermons and through sort of emphasizing that, if you were dreaming that God was talking to you, God only really talks to like the correct sort of people, like priests and saints.
The middleman.
Sure.
Yeah.
There has to be a middleman. Yeah.
Exactly. And it just, this idea that you have to have that structure, because otherwise everyone is sort of looking at their own dreams and their own experiences as equally powerful. And if you're in a sort of hierarchy system, you have to make sure that whatever the king is dreaming is more important than whatever, Joe Potato grows.
And I tell you, the 1% has been at this for a long time.
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of its origins in those sort of things. Just a small group of people
don't get
seem to control the rest. And
don't get them started.
It seems to be historically true, though.
No, it is. I mean, if you look at feudalism and what it actually was, it basically, not that we necessarily live in a feudal society today, but similar concepts,
Maybe we're just not supposed to know that. Right. Good blinders out there, but that's another show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're always going to have the powerful people, and then kind of everyone else. And that was actually something we see. I had mentioned before that there's a lot of historical precedent for witches interacting with fairies. And one of the reasons that was kind of problematic, which is how we know about it, was because it upended that power system. It was people who were being taught and learning from the fairies, usually things relating to healing, and then going out and making a living off of that in a world where, you weren't supposed to be outside the system, basically. Medical doctors have always frowned, as it turns out, on, the person down the street who has home remedies.
Folk medicine.
Yeah.
Even though we know today,
we see a lot of particularly, a lot of it does work. A lot of modern medicine actually is based in like folk medicine, like aspirin comes from willow bark,
right?
That kind of thing.
It's something with yarrow, I believe, too, in it, and it's a healing property. I forget the name of the.
St. John's Wort. There's all kinds of things. Yeah, very interesting. And those things weren't, you weren't allowed. Or you're a witch. She's a witch. Does she flip? That kind of
stuff. Quoting Monty Python. This is awesome.
Not dead yet. Monty Python.
We love Monty Python. We were just talking about some of those movies. So.
Best movie ever.
Yeah, it is. It is really funny.
But I'm not dead yet.
Bring out your dead.
I was going to ask you about the certain communities, different communities. They have different folklore. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yep. Most folklore is kind of regional. And then, let me start this over again.
Okay.
We look at folklore. Folklore generally is cultural. So you have different cultures, but have their own sort of take on different beliefs relating to things. And then within a culture, you have regional variants. So, let's say in Scotland, you have belief in fairies and the good folk. And what they might believe in the northern part of Scotland is going to be similar to, but not identical to, what we have in the south. So like there's a belief in southern Scotland, in the lowlands, that the fairies pay a tithe to hell. So this is a very common belief across a lot of folklore in different Celtic countries, that when Christianity came in, they kind of had to find a way to make fairies fit into the system because people weren't willing to stop believing in them. And if you have angels who are good and, servants of God, and you have demons that are bad, fallen angels that are against God, where do fairies fit in? And what a lot of people decided, and what's become a lot of the folklore, is they're kind of in the middle. They're not angels, they're not good enough for heaven, but they're not demons, they're not bad enough for hell, which is why they're kind of stuck here in our world, as it were. And they can be helpful and they can be harmful. They can kind of go either way. So they're sort of in that mid-range. But we have this particular Scottish belief, which is localized, like I said, in the south, that the fairies, basically they're not bad enough to be in hell, but they kind of pay rent to the devil. To not be in hell. Stay there. It's a really fascinating folk belief, actually. And so every 7 years, they have to give him a tithe, a certain amount of souls or people. And they don't want to pay their own people. So they usually try to get humans to use instead. So we have all these folk accounts of that. And of course, there's some scholars who think that this was originally a way to explain changelings or explain stories about fairies stealing humans, which fairies steal humans across like all folklore everywhere. And that this became one way for this particular area to explain why. Why do they do that? Well, this is why. But then in other places, you have different beliefs, different understandings. Like in Ireland, you still have these beings, these what we would call fairies in English, the Aoife, the good folk, and they still have a lot of similarities in general, but they are not really seen in the same way. They're not strictly in that angel demon category. They're kind of their own third thing. They have their own islands in the West that they're referred to, or they have these fairy hills that we were talking about earlier that they can go in and out of. So it's similar beliefs, but it's different depending on where you go.
Sure. That's why I asked that question, because I thought so.
That's
I've read a lot about that.
Yeah. And what were the words for fairy in Irish that you just mentioned?
Oh, Aois, AOS, and then that's Ace, means people, and then she, it's usually spelled SIDHE, but it's pronounced she. Fairy hills, fairy mounds.
Yeah.
So people of the fairy hills.
So
basically.
it would be good for research, I imagine. Knowing, excuse me, knowing that, I have a tickle on my throat that will not go away. So I apologize. That's why I'm hitting that Dunkin' Donuts cup every 3 seconds. What is the word fae?
Yeah.
Yep. The word fae is such an interesting term because it's gotten super popular in the last couple of years. And it's actually sort of a throwback retro term. Or it's the French word for fairy, depending on how you want to look at it. But basically, if you go back about 800 years to the 12th century, we see the word fae kind of first coming in. It comes from Old French, and it means things that are enchanting, that have an enchanting nature. And this was taken into English as fairy, again, meaning sort of this land that these beings come from, land of enchantment, if you will. And then it came to be applied to the beings themselves. So you have the land of fairy, and then you have fairies that come from there. Also, of course, still used for anything that's sort of enchanting. Hence, like you had mentioned before, Morgan Le Fay. Fae is still the modern French word for fairies, but that's kind of where it originally comes from in English, is also rooted in that. So we see people using fae and fairy interchangeably because they mean the same thing. We also see people who kind of use fae as a very general term for all of these different beings, and then fairy as a more specific type of thing. So
that's interesting, and that makes total sense because England and these more of the older European countries were often fighting each other and claiming spots of land, right? So this, that area over there, those hills used to be French, but now they're English. But of course, the people that lived in those hills would have the same words, right? So just kind of over time, cross cultures.
And, northern France was originally, well, still is, I shouldn't say was originally, is one of the Celtic language speaking areas. Breton.
I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah, I don't know that either.
So you have a lot of tie-ins with the folklore. We were just talking about the difference between the regional and the more general. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of the same things that we would see in like Wales or Cornwall or even England, Scotland, Ireland, Isle of Man, all those places. You'll find a lot of that as well in northern France, because of this cultural influence from Breton. So it's really interesting.
Very interesting.
It is. It reminds me of Native American history even a little bit too, and how the tribes, can have some common beliefs or similar beings that the tribes were aware of, but maybe had different names between tribes.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right.
No, I was giggling because since my daughter, my baby girl, was little, I used to call her my little fairy fae. I still do. So that's why I was giggling before when you said that about fairies and fae. That's what I call her.
Yep. If you read some of the older sources, again, like go back 300-400 years, you'll see them used a lot together, or even fairy and elves used together, because they'll use fairy as an adjective to mean like enchanting. So you see like fairy elves, enchanting elves, otherworldly elves. So you just tell her you were being traditional.
Right. That's really cool. And it is interesting that elves, are kind of used it. And in the U.S., the idea of an elf is more related with Christmas than anything else, probably, or Keebler cookies, right?
Unless you like Tolkien. If you like
But then,
Tolkien, then you get a whole different kind of elf.
That's true. That's absolutely true. But in the Scandinavian cultures and such, they viewed elves much like the fairies of Ireland.
Yep.
Now people talk about
It's
mechanical
really
elves, but
fascinating.
that's a whole other thing too.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to me the way that these terms can have different meanings or different understandings depending on who we're talking to. So if you're talking to people who are more in like academia, more scholarly, fairies, elves, goblins, imps even are kind of interchangeable to a degree because that's how they were always used historically. Fairies and elves were kind of synonymous. Different root languages that they came from, but they were kind of used for the same beings. And you would see in a description something being called a fairy and then called an elf in the same kind of discussion. And then we do have this sort of branching that we've seen, like you were mentioning with elf in particular, where you have this idea of Santa's elves that's kind of come into pop culture. So a lot of people, if you say elf in the US, they're going to picture that sort of tiny shoemaking, toy building.
Right, with the Christmas hat on.
Right. Dressed for the holidays.
Sure.
If you say elf in like Iceland, you get a very different kind of understanding of what we're talking about. And if you, like I said, if we were talking about Tolkien's elves are kind of based on the older Norse and Germanic understanding of what elves were, which is also something we see in Scotland because Scotland had a lot of Norse cultural influence for quite a while. So you more see the use of the word elf there than in other places. I could really get my nerd going.
No, please.
A lot of this.
Bring it on. We're nerds too, so this is awesome.
It's just because I have a lot of passion for the subject. So I have a ridiculous amount of trivia knowledge when it comes to all of this.
I'm kind of like that with 80s metal, which is weird. But no, feel free. Fairies wear boots. But
I so want to go off on 80s metal now. I've been diverted.
Right? That could be a whole nother podcast. What do you know about fairies? The fairies wear boots, man.
Yeah. The crossover between fairies and hair metal bands.
Right.
I'm pretty sure there's a Venn diagram there.
That's great. Did you want to answer the
question? We had a question here. Let me bring it up on our screen. This comes from Brad Roberts, who asks, I'm interested in how fairies connect with humans, if children were better to connect with, and if fairies had any influence or power over humans.
Okay. This is going to take a little bit to unpack, so everybody get comfortable. Fairies definitely do connect with humans in various ways. That can be a positive thing or a negative thing, which I've mentioned a couple times here. We were talking at the very beginning about roads getting diverted. The reason that they did that, the reason that there was this strong belief that you don't mess with fairy hills, you don't mess with fairy trees, or Allfather if you're in Iceland, you don't mess with these things, is because there's this idea, this belief that fairies really can mess you up, and they will. Especially if you kind of mess with their stuff. You don't want to damage a fairy tree. You don't want to destroy something that belongs to them because, again, this is looking at the folklore and the beliefs. They can cause sickness. They can cause madness. They can kill people. All of that is stuff that we have references to, which is part of why in some places they take this very seriously. You don't mess with these things because the idea is if you do, there's some serious consequences that can happen. Of course, they can also be benevolent and beneficial. It's not all negative and scary, but this is why there's a lot of respect kind of given to that. So when we look at how fairies connect with humans with that in mind, We have a lot of stories, again, going back hundreds of years, of people who have learned from the fairies, who are taught particularly healing knowledge, healing methods, also sometimes ways to like predict the future kind of things, divination, and sometimes just basic life skill kind of things. We have stories of fairies who teach people how to be musicians or better musicians. So this idea that they can share knowledge or give knowledge to people, to humans, goes back quite a ways and has a lot behind it. How the humans in question actually connect to them depends, because there's so much folklore about this. In most cases, it seems like the fairies kind of come to the human. They kind of pick that person. In some cases, it's the human sort of does something to reach out or to try to connect to them. Usually, it's kind of understood if you as the human are trying to reach out to the fairies, there's a bit of a risk in it. There was a thing that's discussed in Welsh folklore about going and sleeping in a specific fairy location with the idea that it's either going to kill you, make you crazy, or make you a poet. And poets, of course, are very, esteemed people. But it's that risk, you're going to be dead, mad, or a poet. Right.
There you go.
Right. If children are better to connect with them, that's a bit of a catch-22. It is said that children are more likely to see the good folk, and to be aware when they're around to perceive them. As I mentioned much earlier, I myself had an experience seeing them when I was very young. And there certainly are a lot of accounts of that sort of thing. It seems to be to some degree because children are more open-minded and less skeptical than adults, and children are not going to try to talk themselves out of an experience.
They're innocent. They have no idea. So
right.
Basically.
Right. If you as an adult encounter someone who seems not quite human, there's something otherworldly about them. They seem to know things they shouldn't be able to know, or, without telling them what's going on with you, they're giving you the perfect advice that you needed to hear right in that moment. And they're just a strange and unusual kind of person that appears out of nowhere and disappears again. You as an adult are going to find ways to rationalize all of that. Mm-hmm. Well, I just didn't see them walk up. I just didn't see where they must have, gone off to. And, they must have just coincidence that they said what I needed to hear right in that moment. Whereas children are much more open to like, well, she wasn't there a second ago. And then she just appeared. You know what I'm saying, though? Like, children don't second guess or try to explain things that aren't explainable, that are otherworldly.
Right. Been taught not to.
Exactly. Like I said, they're still naive and they're innocent.
Of things that way.
Right. No. The flip side to that, which I'd mentioned, is that fairies, again, across cultures and millennia, really, are known to kind of occasionally take human children. They take them for multiple reasons in the folklore, but there's, again, that sort of layer of risk. If you're encouraging your child to connect to these beings, particularly if you're not focusing so much on the sort of like garden fairies, the little winged ones, there would be a risk with that if it does work and they do really like your child, they might decide to keep them. And then that's a whole lot of problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, like I said, this is
like the Santa Krampus thing, right? Where Krampus was like a threat, like, you don't go to bed or eat your vegetables, which I imagine were pretty limited. Eat your carrots or Krampus will get you.
Yeah, you're going to end up in Krampus' sack. Yeah.
Get in the bag, kid.
Yep. And, like I said, this is cross-cultural, and this goes back quite a ways. The oldest account we have of Western European fairies is Irish, and it dates from probably about the 5th century. We have it in writing a little bit later than that, but they think based on the language in the written account that it probably goes back to the 5th century. And it's basically the story of a fairy woman who appears and convinces the king's son to leave with her, and takes him back into the fairy, and they're never seen again. So, this idea that if fairies really like a person, they will take the person, that goes back a long, long ways into mythology, really.
So they take this person to their wherever, right? Their lair, their mound, wherever it is, tree.
Yep. Into the other world, yeah.
Into the other realm.
What do they do with them? Put them to work, or what?
Generally, probably, yeah. They become servants. Sometimes. This is, again, we have this huge range of folklore. So there's certain types of fairies. Hags, for example.
Yes.
Ecstasy, which is water horses, which is a type of fairy. Beings like that, they do eat people. They do eat humans. So that is definitely an option. Not a good option, but it's an option. We definitely have. Yeah, I'm going to remember that. That's what we will call it from now on, the culinary option. We do also have accounts, definitely, of them taking humans, children and adults to be servants. There's one account, this is another Welsh one, I think this one goes back to the 12th century, of a boy who is kind of taken into fairy to basically be the companion of the king's son, who's also a boy. And he eventually decides he wants to go back and see his mother, and the fairies are not okay with that, and they chase him, and shenanigans ensue. But he eventually gets back to his mother, and it turns out he's been missing for like 3 weeks. He thought it had only been a few days, because that's how fairy works. There's this time difference that happens. We have an account, I think this one might be English, of a girl who's hired to sort of be a nanny for this boy, and has to put an ointment on his eyes every day. Fairy ointment is a thing that you find in multiple stories. And of course, one day she accidentally touches her own eye and realizes that she's in the other world, and that the boy she's watching is a fairy, and that his father is a fairy. And
Wow.
The father, of course, immediately fires her, because that was like one of the rules, was that she's not supposed to use the ointment herself. And then she spends a lot of time trying to get back into the other world and fairy, and they never succeeds.
So
we have these accounts. There are some people. Yeah, there's some people. There's a really famous account in Scotland, and we find it. There's a prose version that goes back, I think, to the 15th century, and then there's a ballad version that is like 17th century, and that's Thomas the Rhymer. And it's the story of this man who basically is sort of laying down underneath some trees on a hill one day and sees the fairy queen. And she takes him into her service, effectively, and takes him with her into fairy, and tells him that he's going to serve her for a certain amount of time. He's gone from the mortal world for 7 years. And in payment, he gets a nice new outfit and the ability to only ever tell the truth. He does try to return that second one, because he tries to explain to her that he's going to have a really hard time. And I'm paraphrasing the ballad here, but this literally is what it says. He tries to explain to her he's going to have a really hard time wooing a woman or haggling in the market if he can't lie. But she's insistent. I mean, he's not wrong.
No.
She's insistent, so he becomes known as True Thomas or Thomas the Rhymer. But the folklore attached to this says that after a certain amount of time, he married, he had children, blah blah blah. But after a certain amount of time, she did return. She actually sent a white deer as a sign to him to lead him back into fairy, and then he returned to her. So, I mean, that is an account of someone who's taken and kicked out and then taken back again.
Are there, it is a weird question, but are there stories of, and it sounded a little like that, relations is a nice way to put it, between fairy folk and humans?
Yeah, so true story. The number one most common question I get asked on my social media and in general is that question. Basically, do humans and fairies have carnal relations? Put it that way. And the answer is yes, they do. There's, again, a ton of folklore about this. In Iceland, if you ever see accounts of people whose last name is like Alf anything, Alfsdottir, Alfson, it literally means like elf daughter, elf son, because the belief was that the Alfar would occasionally have children with humans. If the mother was human, then the child would stay in the human world. And if the father was human, then the child would be with the mother in the other world. We have accounts in the Celtic language material. This would be in Scotland and Ireland, in the Orkney Isles, of selkies, which are a type of fairy. They look like a seal when they're in the water, and they can come out of the water and take off the seal skin and look human. And there's a whole sort of genre in fairy folklore about seal wives, where fishermen would see this seal woman take off the sealskin coat, and they would steal the coat. And without that, the selkie can't turn back into a seal, can't go back into the ocean. And she would kind of have no choice except to marry this fisherman. And then she would have children with him and be his wife until she found the seal skin, wherever he was hiding it. In some of the accounts, like in some of the Irish accounts, it's actually one of the children finds the seal skin and kind of comes running up to the mother saying, "Oh, look, mother, what is this leather that I found like hidden in the thatch," or whatever it was. And of course, the mother, as soon as she sees it, returns to the sea and leaves the children behind, leaves everything else behind. There's one very sad account of that where when she gets the sealskin back, she kind of says something, which most of the story she doesn't, where she's like, I have 7 children in the sea and I have 7 children on land. What do I do?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Here, there, and everywhere.
Yep. And then goes back to the sea, because that's kind of their nature, as they belong in the ocean. So, and I could keep going. I could literally fill the next hour.
He's from the, his heritage is from the Orkney Islands.
Yeah, I get some Orkney
He
in me, and
does.
I'm
Nice.
fascinated with them a little bit. I've seen where they found these primitive structures when they kept the bones of like a village, an entire village was
Longhouse.
all
Yes.
found like in one particular building. Early civilization.
I think that's one of the oldest
Yes.
Neolithic structures that's ever been found.
Exactly. Yeah.
I would love to go visit that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Us too.
And I imagine they didn't have a lot to look at, so the sea would be so important. They obviously, eat a lot of fish and seals and things of that nature, right? And all that kind of reminds me a little bit of like mermaid lore.
Right.
Yep.
With the seal skin.
And it's kind of the same, like when a lot of people, when they try to explain mermaid lore, they look at like, well, what animal could sailors have been seeing that they thought was maybe a mermaid? So people often will point to manatees and be like, personally, I've seen manatees, and even if I was at sea for a year or two, I don't think I would think that was an attractive woman.
Still not that good looking, but
they're
it's like a little
so cute, though.
human-esque
I wouldn't.
something.
They are cute.
Right.
Maybe
Well,
I don't
and
want to cross that line.
Exactly, the human-esque thing, and that's where the tie-in with the selkies comes in, is that people have tried to explain it as seals have such evocative eyes. if you've ever seen a seal.
Yes, they do.
They really have very, people will usually say human-like eyes, but they're very emotive. And so one of the theories is that, maybe, you see this animal that looks like it has human eyes and like a human spirit to it. And then you start to think, maybe it does. Maybe it is.
You've been out at sea way too long.
I mean, I
Right?
personally am not one for the rational explanations. I just like to believe that there really are seal folk out there somewhere. But, to be fair, to present the
Right,
skeptical
right.
explanation.
Sure.
Can't say otherwise. It's not like, I spend too much time underwater, or even man does, right?
There was a question about that I really liked about the black-eyed children, and if there's any connection with the fairies.
That is an often debated point. I was actually on a show with Joshua McCutcheon a little while ago, because he's sort of a big UFO expert. And we have very different opinions on this. So in fairness, I'm going to try to present the even-handed view here. There are certainly people who see the black-eyed children purely as sort of an urban folklore kind of a thing. That it's sort of a modern story that's come around. I personally, when I look at just the accounts that are out there for black-eyed children, a lot of it does line up and fit with wider patterns we see with fairies and fairy folklore. The idea that they're trying to sort of trick you into doing something that seems harmless. Fairies are sort of notorious for that in a lot of the folklore. Trying to get you to give them something or let them do something, particularly the idea of them coming into your home, the ones that show up at people's houses. There is a thread of that in Irish folklore on usually at specific days, but they would try to get you to give them either fire or milk or something like that, and they would sort of take away the luck of your household if you did it. The idea that they appear as children, that they are often described in clothing that's out of date, like a generation or two behind, that's extremely common in fairy folklore. Fairies are often described as appearing fairly human, but their clothing is usually not right. They look like they, have not gone shopping in 50 years, kind of a thing. The modern analogy that I use for people is it's like in modern 21st century terms, if someone was walking around in 1970s, bell bottoms and a tie-dyed shirt, kind of a thing, it would just sort of be a little out of place. And that idea that these children are usually wearing something that's not what children should be wearing at that time. All of that kind of fits in with different aspects of fairy lore. So my stance tends to be there's not enough information, but I could see them fitting into fairy folklore.
That's really interesting. I've never thought of it that way, and I'm going to
Absolutely. That's
have an
really
open mind
cool.
about that one.
It almost ties into just the idea of ghosts and, people seeing ghosts being dressed in like Victorian garb, or, some other time period.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do when anyone asks me about like cryptids or modern stories or modern encounters is I try to ignore whatever labels being put on it. Like if you're asking me about Mothman, for example, because that's very high profile, everyone's heard of it, famous cryptid. But I'll just put all that aside and I'll just strictly look at what happens in the encounters. How is this being described? How does it interact with people? And does that fit what we would expect from fairies? Because there are certain things that are sort of like if we had a checklist, you'd be like, okay, do they seem physical? Do they have physical interactions? If no, then that's not likely to be a fairy. Whereas ghosts, more likely to be a ghost.
Sure.
Not that ghosts can't have physical moments, but full on like shaking your hand, patting your back seems to be physically present in stories, encounters people have. That's very much a fairy thing. So I just go down that checklist of, what do you see in folklore repeatedly, and does that fit with what people are describing or not?
Right, because there's a lot of commonalities, and it you don't want to logically, or generalize something based on someone else's experience. The things that they say about that experience may relate to other things, and they may not understand what they witnessed.
That's like the Beast of Bray Road. There's so many, I don't know if you've heard about that, but there's so many things that actually...
It's a werewolf story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
But they took pictures of it and like left hunting cams out, and you can see like mist coming and eating what was it, a dead deer.
Oh yeah,
that they found on the side of the road, and it's on camera, and it's really cool. And that reminds me,
some interesting
now
data
that maybe it does have something to do with the fairy.
Sure. I mean, the idea of werewolves certainly ties in with like Bigfoot, and ties in with a whole range of cryptids, devil dogs, or not the kind you eat, but you know what I mean. Demon dogs.
Well,
hellhounds.
Hellhounds.
Yeah.
Sounds like
Chupacabra.
Chupacabra.
Yeah.
I love that word. Chupacabra.
And there's a lot of this stuff. It's very blurry lines.
Yeah.
Yes.
You reminded me when you said hellhounds, because, for example, the lore that's around things like that, hellhounds, devil dogs, fairy hounds, black shuck, grim. There's all kinds of names in England for these. It's less of a clearly defined group as sort of a constellation of similar experiences that have a couple different options for explanations. Because we do have accounts of black hounds, devil hounds, that are clearly ghosts, ghost dogs, which are super fascinating to me. I love animal ghosts, by the way. It's a little subgenre of hauntings. Super interesting.
Sure.
But then you also have encounters with these otherworldly dogs that are clearly fairy hounds. They just, the way that they act and the things that they do and the areas they're found in kind of ties them into fairy lore. And then you have the third category, which kind of doesn't fit either of the other two.
What about the capture of them on, say, film or modern technology, and how people, see them now in today's modern world?
Fairies in general, you mean?
Yes, sure.
Yep. So I have two schools of thought on this. Everyone's about to hate me, so it's been nice being appreciated for an hour. I'm going to ruin it now.
No, you're good.
It'd be fun.
Love your insights. Thank you.
Yes.
I admit that I am one of those people who always applies Occam's razor to everything. Whatever the simplest explanation is usually the explanation. I'm horribly paraphrasing that, by the way. When it comes to most of what people put out there as fairies caught on film, it's almost always either pareidolia. It's not. It's people are seeing something in there because that's how our brain works, or it's an insect. Especially the videos, a lot of times it's an insect.
Oh yeah.
Don't even get us started with those. It's a moth, for God's sake. It's a piece of dust,
Yep.
Not Mothman. No, I think pareidolia accounts
Chris wrote the book on pareidolia, so yeah.
A lot of stuff. I did write a book on.
See, this is why we're friends now.
Psychosomatic pareidolia,
awesome.
which is how people bring it on themselves, sort of. But
and I think a lot of times with fairy people who are interested in fairies, that is the explanation, though. It's that psychosomatic pareidolia. They're seeing it because they really, really, really want it to be there. They want to see it. Now, I am 100% a believer, and obviously, my entire life is based on me believing in this. But I think that we have to be skeptical and rational when it comes to evidence. and look at what we're actually dealing with. Do I think it's possible to catch a fairy on video or in a photograph? Sure. I think it can be done. I think it probably has been done and people just aren't aware of what they're actually seeing a lot of the times. But I think a lot of what's put out there as evidence is really not, it's things that can be explained.
Sure, you almost need that ointment you mentioned earlier to put in your eyes.
Yeah.
And then let me look at my Facebook feed and go, there's one.
Yep. There's
So much
a
is
really,
yeah.
yep. There's a really popular one that goes around, and it's clearly a time-lapse exposure kind of photo. I don't know the technical term, I'm sorry, but you can see the person's hand in it is blurry because they've obviously moved their hand as it was being taken. So whatever bug they're taking a picture of, it's like a mayfly or something similar, it makes it look like it has legs and the little double fairy wings that we expect.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, well,
I think I may have seen that one, actually.
I think we did.
Yeah.
See that.
Probably.
I think I remember seeing some
And then we had
supposed fairy evidence, and it was like,
it gets shared around a lot.
Yeah.
Remember the skeleton? There was one a couple of years ago. It was a skeleton, and they had X-rays of it. Did you see that?
Yeah,
And I don't believe it.
No. There's
the skeleton of the fairy.
Of the
right?
fairy, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
There's a
Kinda like
couple
mermaid.
images of fairy skeletons that go around. And there's also a supposedly mummified leprechaun that goes around, that are just constantly circulating online in any communities that are interested in fairies. And they're art pieces. The what is it called? It's like a pixie that was supposedly found, I think, in North Carolina, skeleton. And then there's another one that's set up. It's got the two full wings and the full skeleton.
Mhm.
And both of those, if I remember correctly, are a London-based artist. Who this is just what he does.
Yeah. I think that's the one we were looking at.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it reminds me of the Atacama mummy,
The
which
Atacama.
I was really into, and then very disappointed to find out it was not
Yep.
an alien mummy.
Yep. There was one going around recently that I saw on Facebook that is in a museum. I can't remember if it's in the Netherlands, but it's somewhere in that general geographic area, and it's supposed to be a mermaid skeleton, and it is in the museum. It really is there. So you have the upper torso that looks human, and then this sort of desiccated giant fishtail thing. And the person sharing it was like, "Oh, this is in an actual museum. Like, this is real evidence. It's an art piece. It
Sure.
like even the museum has a label on it that says like this is by an artist."
Yeah, and people would make
You know.
stuff that was interesting too. In the past, it would appear old things in the spiritualist movement, and during those times of the late 1800s, making curiosities and all sorts of things that probably wind up in museums now.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and the idea of gaffs, I mean, that goes back to Barnum and Bailey, with his Fiji mermaid, which is a monkey sewn to a fish.
Oh, geez.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Yeah, there was some pretty horrible things that have happened in the circus, right?
yeah. But it's again this idea that people really want it to be true. So, if you really want to believe it, you really want it to be true.
It's the psychosomatic part of that.
It is,
psychosomatic pareidolia.
Yep.
People listening to recordings and really, there's like just somebody breathed or something and they're hearing things because they really want to, and have maybe spent 12 hours with the recorder listening to it. You can bring the pareidolia on yourself.
Yep. Well, and I think that's why, we all have to be very careful. This is why I try to remain skeptical. And I've had personal experiences that, can't be rationalized or explained away. They are just things that have happened that have no explanation. But there's a reason when I share stories, like talking with you, I try to share stories that other people were there with me.
Sure, to have witnesses.
So it's not just me saying,
we understand this.
Yeah, other people saw it.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yep, definitely.
That's really cool. Can we touch back on the paganism? And I know a lot of your books that talk about even Norse paganism and Odin.
Odin is also a whole genre unto himself, I think. My primary focus is Irish, and then more sort of generally Celtic language speaking cultures, but primarily Irish. And probably I think it was 2006, I also started studying and getting interested in Norse culture and Germanic culture through the pagan aspect, which would be in the U.S. referred to as heathenry, and also because they do have such very similar beliefs when it comes to fairies. When it comes to, they would obviously not call them fairies, but those types of beings. And I was really interested in the sort of cultural crossover and overlap. So I'd mentioned, Scotland, we see a lot of Norse influence. Ireland has a little bit of Norse influence because they were settled at one point, certain places, by the Norse. And then Iceland has a lot of Irish influence because a lot of the women who were brought over there to be wives and to be servants were Irish. So we see this sort of fascinating blend of cultural beliefs and cultures. And it kind of pulled me into this this related area, we'll say. I did write a book about Odin. He is so fascinating, very popular in modern heathenry, and there's just so much about him. There's so much depth to him. And he's one of the more interestingly nuanced, I think, deities that you're going to run across, because really his whole thing is staving off the end of the world, which is a big sort of principle in Norse cosmology. This idea that we're living in this time period, or some people argue this has already happened, but I'm going to talk about it like we're living in it. Sure. We're living in this time period that will eventually conclude with what it's called Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the gods. And really not something anybody wants to have to experience. It's like, endless winter, the sun and the moon get eaten by giant wolves. The dead come back to fight. Just a generally unpleasant time if you're human and stuck in the middle of it.
I imagine they had a lot of unpleasant times, right? And I think some of that took place in the winter and winter solstice. And I always thought of that as like, well, a certain amount of the tribe and clan or whatever they call themselves are not going to be here in the spring. So there's Odin in the sky to kind of cart off some of these folks, right? You'll live again, battle again. Yep.
And that's kind of Odin's big thing, is sort of preparing for and fighting against this inevitable end of the cycle. It's not actually the literal forever end of the world. It's just the end of the cycle, and then it starts up again, kind of resets, if you will. But it's interesting to look at him because, unlike other deities that are more straightforward, they're going to do what they need to do to protect humanity, kind of what gods generally do. The ones that people worship anyway. Odin's much more, he's going to do whatever needs to be done to delay this end of the world. And so we have stories where he does things that are kind of morally questionable, ethically gray, we'll say.
Yeah. Right. That's a nice way to put it. I think they were ethically gray times, though. Like that.
Yeah.
Yep. For sure.
Yeah. I saw something really funny on social media the other day that was talking about Odin's morality and compared it to a roulette wheel. And I was like, well, that's not entirely wrong.
Right. Drink the blood of your enemies out of the skull.
But are they dishwasher safe is the question.
There you go.
True that. A lot of folks like fairy houses, and you mentioned making them as a child. Do you think that they do attract fairies, and what would be like a proper way to go about making them if you wanted to attract the fae to your backyard?
Sure. I will say up front that I am pro fairy house and anti fairy door, which I realize seems a little conflicting, but I know fairy doors are super popular. I'm kind of against having any door that's sort of inviting anything in that happens to wander by.
I agree.
It seems like a bad idea.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wouldn't personally recommend fairy doors, but to be clear, before we get to fairy houses, though, the concept of those goes way, way back in different forms, depending on how loosely or tightly you want to connect things, all the way back to the Romans, who used to have, it would be little shrines that looked like houses for the lares, which were the house spirits, the spirits that would live in the home to kind of keep the luck and keep things positive in a house. So the idea of fairy houses to me is a much more benevolent, positive kind of deal. If you have one inside your house, it's generally much like the Roman version, going to be for the beings that are already there. And it kind of gives them a place and acknowledgement and tells them that you want them to be happy. Because if they're happy, then they tend to make everything around them run smoother and be better, that sort of thing. If you have them outside, like in the garden or in the yard, the idea is still generally the same, but instead of house spirits, house fairies, you're going to get whatever happens to be already in that area. It's not going to draw in anything new, but it's going to be a sign that you're acknowledging that you know they're there and that you want to be respectful and connect to them. And that's usually never going to be a bad thing. Generally, they appreciate that, and then most people find, if they do this, that as long as they're kind of keeping up with it and making sure that it doesn't fall into disarray and get all, messed up, that things tend to seem more positive and work a little better. Feel like they're more going your way, if you will. So I'm in favor of the fairy houses.
No doors.
They're a good idea. No doors.
I am right with you with that.
No random.
What do you?
Yeah, no random doors to whatever wanders by.
What would you put in them to attract them? Are there things that they are known to like?
In the fairy house itself, I wouldn't personally put anything inside. I'd focus more on making it like a nice little house.
Mhm.
You certainly can leave things out. We might call them offerings. Obviously, in traditional cultures, that's not what they would call them. But milk, they really like cream, any kind of dairy product. And this is another one of those really strange global things. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a Buddhist and is a really super, super smart guy. He translates Sanskrit, is kind of what he does as a job. But he was talking to me about the close equivalent they have to what we would call fairies in Tibet. You also offer them milk. They like milk. I know there's at least one kind of being in Africa that's similar to what we would call fairies. This would be on the sort of in the area of Nigeria, that is known to like milk. Will even steal milk. And the same thing, sort of wherever you go, there's this weird, if it's a culture that has milk or dairy products, then the fairy beings that are around there are going to like milk and dairy products. It just seems to be a global constant.
Yeah, it's in the global consciousness or something. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I have no idea why. It just...
Well, there's other phenomena like that, where like pyramids, right, is a often cited example. Like, how did these cultures know to make things that look like pyramids, that they couldn't have possibly interacted?
Yeah.
We make little cakes for them and put little berries, and we put it outside the house. Nothing in the house, but outside the little houses and stuff. And leave them offerings.
Yep. Cakes, fresh fruit, those are both excellent. Bread is another one that's traditional. Honey is not traditional, but it's very popular now. Like a lot of people offer honey. Basically, my guideline for it is anything that's like fresh and I don't mean natural in the sense of like, picked off a tree natural, but something that doesn't have a lot of chemicals or not really processed, highly processed.
Maybe local honey.
Yeah.
That local honey is always a preferred substance for all sorts of things, be it hoodoo or folk magic and witchcraft. Sure.
That's because it's good stuff.
That's
for
right.
us, maple syrup.
People.
Maple syrup could be an option for those of us in New England.
That's right.
I'm getting hungry.
Whatnot, for sure.
I mean, again, like you would want to make sure anything you give, really, you want to make sure it's good quality and that it is what it's supposed to be. So, like, if you offer honey, make sure it's actually honey, because I know some of the stuff on the market might not be. Maple syrup,
And these things they're kind of small, and it remind me a little bit of a birdhouse. Is there a reason why? Is it thought that they're small, or is it just because it's more practical? And what is the attraction? Is it more the intent that you built this for, as a sign of respect for an entity that they will recognize it as their own?
Yep, I think it's a combination of practical and that it's a sign of respect. When we're talking about these beings, you really do have that whole size range. So, some of them certainly are small, but a lot of them are not. But it's this idea that you're making a gesture, and when it comes to particularly the ones inside the home, or the garden, it's the practical aspect of, you really can't build a literal house. I should say 99% of us can really not build a literal house, to offer to the good folk, or, even a moderately sized shed. But pretty much, anybody one way or another can build the equivalent. Basically. Can build like the equivalent of like a birdhouse, and then just decorate it however you want to. And
we made ours out of sticks, and it took us a little while, and moss, and just nature.
Yep.
We would make ours out of that.
Yep. When I was really little, and I used to make them, I would just collect, stones and twigs and little branches, and I'd have little stone tables with acorn cups. I mean, I got kind of ridiculous with it, but
we did too. That's great.
Yeah.
It's cute.
But yeah, it's putting out that effort. And if you search online, you can find a million examples of these. The only thing that I usually recommend to people, because this is sort of popular and trendy and you'll find videos about it, maybe don't use plastic. I've seen like some trends, especially like recycling soda bottles and making little fairy houses. And, I don't think it's going to offend them or upset them or anything. It just, to me, I think you'd be better off with a more natural sort of approach. Yeah.
Eco-friendly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're dealing with Earth, right? You want something that helps sustain it, or at least recycles back into it.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have soda bottles, recycle them in the actual recycling so they get, reused or whatever it is. However, they get processed through that, as opposed to putting it in your yard or somewhere where, after a few years, it's not going to hold up well, and then you can't recycle it anymore because you've painted it and glued stuff to it and done whatever else. So, maybe just a slightly different approach.
Your new book, you have a new book out. Could you tell us the title of it, please?
That would depend on which new book you're talking about, because I
wasn't sure which one you're going to talk about.
have a pernicious habit of constantly writing. So I have a book on Lu, the Irish god Lu, that's coming out in a month. That comes out the beginning of May. So that would be my next one coming out.
Oh, that's interesting. And how do you spell that? I imagine it's not like Lou, like Lou's Cafe or something.
No, it's Lugh.
Okay.
But it's pronounced Lu.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Lou.
Sure. So I write for a publisher called Moon Books, which is out of London, and they have a series called Pagan Portals. And the premise of Pagan Portals is their basic introductory books. So they run about 100 pages, and they're intended to kind of give people all of the essentials that you would need to know on a subject, to cover all the bases, and then you can move deeper into it or not as you choose to. And I've written, I believe Lou might be my 9th. It might actually be more than that, because I honestly can't remember how many of them I've done now, but I've done quite a few. We'll go with that. And I've done several now on different Irish gods and goddesses. My very first pagan portal on an Irish deity was on the Morgan. And then I found that they're really helpful for people because there's not a lot of information just on the Irish deities that's out there. What we tend to find is that you'll get a paragraph or two, maybe a couple pages within another book, but you really don't get a lot of in-depth. And there's so much out there about these deities. There's so much in Irish folklore. There's so much in Irish mythology. People just don't know how to access it or where to go to understand it. So Lu is one of the more popular Irish gods, but because of kind of this situation with resources, he tends to be one that people don't know much about beyond the very surface, sort of the public byline that goes around about him. So I wanted to write something that would kind of dig deeper and get into his stories and his folklore and give people more information. And they're really, with him in particular, some of the others I've done, there are other books out there that you can go further with. But with Lu in particular, there really isn't anything. He just doesn't seem to be one, which is strange because he's very, very popular and there's so much about him.
It's odd because like you said, I only read a couple of paragraphs of it. I didn't know that this whole thing about him, so I can't wait to read your book.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And you do have a lot of
you have a plethora
of books, and they look super interesting.
I like the one
Bad habit.
I think it's a very great book about what is it? Fairies and magic.
It's fairy witchcraft, and just so the listeners know, because this will end up in an audio format, I put the link in our video chats that's going out to several outlets. Mm-hmm. But if you're listening to this on a podcast, you would go to johnhuntpublishing.com/moonbooks. Authors Morgan Daimler. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Morgan?
Daimler, yeah.
Daimler. It was more of a... Okay. I'm sorry. That was our pre-show talk, Kristen and I. Is it Daimler?
Everyone mispronounces it, so it's fine.
That's fine. And her last name is spelled Daimler. Mm-hmm. And the rest of that is as it sounds. johnhuntpublishing.com/moon-books/authors/Morgan-Daimler.
Yes.
Got it.
Good job. But God, you have some really great books here.
Yeah, actually, what? I'm going to share my screen and just, I'd like to show the viewers some of your books, because there's some really cool stuff going on here. I know we were impressed. We're like, oh my gosh, look at that. That's awesome. I want to read all these things.
Because
that is her bag. So let me go here. I'm going to go.
I started writing for Moon in 2012, and I really like them. They're a good publisher.
And I'm going to flash over to.
I also self-publish.
There.
If you happen to be up on Amazon wandering around, I do self-publish some books as well.
Oh, good.
Okay.
So if you are
There it is, Lou.
well, when I was writing my book on the Morgan, which I just mentioned, I realized that a lot of the translations of the Irish myths are not good because they were done basically during the Victorian era, and the translators had a habit of editing things out that they thought were not, appropriate to the morals of the time, or adding stuff in that they thought should be there.
Embellish.
Yeah. And I, purely out of spite, basically taught myself Old and Middle Irish, which is the language the mythology is written in, and started doing translations. So I have some of those.
When you say that, do you mean like Gaelic?
So older. So what you have modern Irish, which is the language today. It is also sometimes called Gaelic, Gaeilge, or a lot of people just call it Irish, modern Irish. And then you have Old and Middle Irish, which I won't inflict the Irish for that on you, but basically it's the difference the same way we would have in English with Old and Middle English. So if you speak modern English, you're not going to be able to understand Old English just looking at it. There's enough of a difference. And it's kind of the same thing with modern Irish versus Old Irish or Middle Irish. It's the same language, but it's an older version of it. It's considered a dead language at this point, Old and Middle Irish, because nobody speaks it anymore. And modern Irish is different enough. The pronunciation is different, and the words are different. So most of them are different.
Wow.
Again, I could language nerd out forever. So
no, that's great.
Cool. That's cool. I had no idea. I actually find that really interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah. Fun fact: modern Scottish Gaelic is actually based in Old Irish, so I can understand some Scottish Gaelic because I have the Old and Middle Irish, which is super fun for me.
Wow, that is so cool. I wish.
That is awesome. That is awesome. And I love the folklore. I know a lot of people, on St. Patrick's Day talk about St. Patrick, but I have some pagan friends that get real upset about that St. Patrick legend. And for the listeners who don't know, I guess there might be like a darker side to that. They're not just about chasing snakes.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have two different St. Patricks going on. You have the actual historic St. Patrick, who, no offense to every Catholic out there, really didn't do very much. He kind of came in, and there was already a Catholic bishop in Ireland, and he converted some people, particularly in around the Ulster area and Armagh. But he, according to his own writing, he really didn't accomplish much. But then we also have this mythic Patrick, this mythic figure, which came about 300 years after St. Patrick lived and died. And the mythic Patrick, when his life story was written down, it was really trying to be on par with and kind of compete with sort of the Irish mythology, the things we've been talking a little bit about in the folklore. So they really kind of gave him a PR makeover and made him this very heroic figure. It's fascinating to read because the stuff that happens in it, like there's one encounter where he and his followers are being pursued by like hostile pagans. So he turns himself and his people into deer, and they flee, in the shape of deer.
Shape-shifting,
right?
Yeah.
Some superpowers right there.
Exactly, because they were trying to make it interesting in a way that the Irish at the time, 7th century Irish, would want to hear about, would be interested in. And when you have all this mythology that's already out there, that's full of, people turning into crows, and, there's other stories of people turning into deer, and sort of all of these, immense things going on, you got to make sure you can compete with that. So yeah, we have him turning his followers into deer. We have him calling on God and creating an earthquake that opens up the earth and swallows a bunch of people, and just all sorts of sort of, I kind of picture it in my head like a comic book. I'm not going to lie to you, because that's sort of the tone of it. And there's definitely some modern pagans that are not fans of the mythic St. Patrick, because he is very much about the dueling druids, and destroying the Irish druids was kind of his,
Yeah, every St. Patrick's Day I get a bunch of feeds in my post, and
Yeah.
kind of pretty, or a bunch of posts in my feed. Don't get that right. It's not feeds in the post.
Yeah.
Can't feed the post.
You can't
post the feed. I don't know. I'm losing it.
I mean, it's social media. You can probably do all of those things.
You probably
exactly.
can. You probably can. Yeah. So the best place for people to find you, speaking of social media, where can they find you?
If I haven't totally frightened everyone away at this point with my love of translating dead languages.
We're going to get a lot of attention from some really intriguing information.
Yeah, this is really fun.
I love
Good conversation. Yeah, I'm all over social media, and I decided very early on to just put everything under my name. So if you go up on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and search Morgan Daimler, again, Daimler, there's only one of me as far as I know. So I should be the one you find. I will warn you, if you follow me on any social media, I do end up sharing a lot of language nerd kind of stuff. So if that cool. Interests you,
we'll be adding you. I know the gentleman who asked that question earlier, Brad, had made some comments as well. He was doing some kind of research into fairies, and he wanted to reach out. So we really appreciate that, and appreciate you coming on.
Yes, thank you again. This is great.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
This was very fun.
We'll do it again. I enjoyed this a lot, and I know you did. Kristen's been
have
looking
a lot
forward
more questions. So
to all of this.
The best part about this subject is that you can talk about it for hours and hours and hours, and there's always more to talk about.
Sure.
Absolutely. We'll revisit it, and we want to check out your books ourselves, so we really appreciate it. Cool. We're just about out of time, but next week we have Nathaniel Gillis coming on the show, our friend and demonologist, and it's also Kristen's birthday. So,
yay.
29.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Wanted to get that out. Once again, thank you again, Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Morgan.
Thank you again for having me.
You're very welcome. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.